We'll be back with the headlines at 8. Now it's time for Newswatch.
The BBC's general election reporting under the spotlight. Welcome to Newswatch with me, Samira Ahmed. Coming up, now that the dust is settling from Labour's victory on Thursday, we hear what you thought of the campaign coverage. And what lessons can BBC News learn from the past 6 weeks? Election nights are a big moment for a broadcaster, and so all eyes were on Clive Myrie and Laura Kuenssberg at 5 to 10 on Thursday night as they kicked off 15 hours of live results programmes on BBC One.
And as Big Ben strikes 10, the exit poll is predicting a Labour landslide.
As the dramatic night unfolded, there was a divided reaction from viewers, with James Ball observing, "The tone of the BBC coverage is a bit odd, overly jovial. It's election night, not breakfast sofa TV." But Matthew Ambrose was impressed with what he saw. BBC, despite all its faults, is the king of election night coverage. No one is even close. Thursday night's coverage was the culmination of an intense period for BBC News, with extensive reporting of the election campaign across television, radio, podcasts and online. It was a campaign which threw up a number of journalistic issues and challenges, and some memorable moments.
So this is it, a general election is on. Power will leave this most powerful of streets, and you'll be able to decide whether he stays or whether he goes.
Mr Farage, are you standing?
Well, we'll find out in a moment, won't we?
Why did you change your mind?
Who knows? Who says I have?
Penny Mordaunt, can you respond to that? Rishi Sunak leaving the D-Day commemorations before the end of the day?
What happened was completely wrong.
The £2,000 claim is misleading. Labour say they won't increase income tax, national insurance or VAT.
Are you two really the best we've got to be the next Prime Minister of our great country?
The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, is ending his campaign as it began, with stunts that make a splash, so he gets the chance to talk about what his party's MPs would argue for.
We did it!
We asked you for your thoughts on how the BBC reported on the campaign, and here's a selection of what you sent us. On email, P. Harbour was complimentary. Thank you for your excellent coverage on the key issues, the airing of concerns in many constituencies and the debate between the leaders hosted by Michelle Hussein, a good balance of audience questions. But Vicky Beale said, the debate was disappointing. Sunak was allowed to consistently shout over and interrupt, often unchallenged. Surely there is a better way. Meanwhile, here's Mike Thaler. I just want to say how great the BBC fact-checking service is. I've wondered for years if there was a way of reining in the politicians and insist on embellishing the truth. This is a good start. But again, there was dissent, with Richard Appleby complaining of not enough or hopelessly late fact-checking, too much taking politicians' statements at face value when far too often they are barefaced lies. And there was more, with this response to our call for comments from the journalist Philip Stevens. Coverage has been shallow, driven by headlines of the moment rather than serious interrogation of politicians on policy substance. Much better, BBC seems to think, to quiz ministers about betting than pensions, defence, education. A viewer called Sue objected to too much Farage. No wonder Ed Davey had to resort to various stunts just to get some media attention. David O'Leary thought there was too much coverage driven by polling, interpretation of polling and parties' campaign lines. Precious little on policy in favour of soundbite-driven game show-style nonsense. Finally, the former BBC foreign correspondent Hugh Sykes also contacted us with his verdict. Too many opinion polls and vox pops, too little getting out and doing some proper reporting, taking the temperature of the nation, choosing topics that have not been set by party agendas. Well, let's talk to two other ex-BBC journalists, Carolyn Quinn was a political correspondent and presenter here up until last year when she left the corporation, including after a 16-year stint presenting Radio 4's The Westminster Hour. And Katie Sell also left the BBC last year, having been in charge of its political output for 8 years. She's now working as a consultant. Welcome to you both, and thank you. I know you were both up probably all night with the general election, so thank you for coming on Newswatch. You'll have heard there, a lot of viewers were wondering whether the BBC, along with other news media, put too much emphasis on opinion polls. Carolyn first.
Well, look, the opinion polls didn't really shift in terms of the divide between Labour and the Conservatives throughout the whole campaign. So you could say perhaps there was a little bit too much emphasis on them. However, they do indicate a mood. They do indicate a way that opinions are shifting and changing. And in that instance, it didn't look as if anything that was done during the campaigns was shifting opinion.
So what do you think, Katie?
I agree that in the end they didn't really shift and they didn't really make any difference. I know there's been a huge debate during the whole campaign about whether there should be a ban on polls.
Especially because of first past the post.
Yeah, and lots of other countries do ban polls during the campaign. I think, as Carolyn says, the story was over by the time we got into the campaign. You know, it didn't move. Mostly campaigns don't move the polls, we know that. So, you know, banning them or not would not have made the slightest bit of difference. And anyway, it's not very British to ban polls. It's not going to happen.
Leaders' debates and interviews were a huge part of election coverage this time. Did they achieve much, or were they, as some viewers felt, just shouting matches or game show style events?
I agree, actually, with a lot of the viewers' views on this. I mean, you know, in the end, it is a shouting match. And I've come to the conclusion that that is what they are, and that actually is just what we should get used to. You know, a debate is by its very nature a debate which involves argument and therefore shouting. And I think that, you know, there is a problem if you're going to watch a debate and you hope that you get great enlightenment of policies. You're not going to get that. I mean, actually, to add on to that, there was massive media, long-form interviews, online fact-check, endless programmes across all the different broadcasters. So it's not as if it was the only thing on offer.
And I think time restrictions.
Yeah.
That's always the problem. If you're limiting a debate to a certain amount of time and 5 minutes per person, there's no way of getting into depth of policy, unlike the long-form interviews. I mean, the Nick Robinson interviews on Panorama, they really did delve and probe into policy in a much more forensic way than any debate could.
Fact-checking. Some viewers liked it. Others felt that the BBC's fact-checking of some of the leaders' claims wasn't effective in closing down the dodgy claims, such as the Tories repeating of £2,000 tax rises under Labour. They kept repeating it regardless. What did you think?
I think they did as good a job as they possibly could in the circumstances. BBC Verify was one of the things that I really appreciated this time. I think it was great to have that real forensic analysis of what was being said. And yes, you know, the 2,000 tax claim that the Conservatives kept pushing against Labour, whatever BBC Verify said, they were still pushing that line. But I think it gave the public at least a chance to weigh up what was really being said. And having somebody like Ben Chew digging down into the policy as well, I thought it worked really, really well. And it was a good innovation this year.
Yeah, I mean, fact-check is a whole industry now, right? Everyone has their own version, and it will definitely be here to stay. So we should get used to it. And I agree. I think it's a great thing.
Carolyn, you know, I've noticed one of our comments was from a former BBC correspondent, Hugh Sykes, who felt there was too much coverage that was driven by simple headlines, like the leaving D-Day early, the betting scandal. Did viewers get enough of actual policies being scrutinised?
I think there's always that argument that the BBC will break a story. The BBC broke the gambling story, or was one of those that broke it, and the D-Day happenings as well. There is a temptation, isn't there, to overdo it. And I think maybe some of the bulletins spent too much time focusing on that, you know, the big, shiny new story, rather than saying, this happened today, now let's look at policy. Because in the end, it's policy that matters. But is policy too boring? Is it much more interesting to have personality stuff? That is the issue. And I think maybe what happened was that you had these big stories, these big moments happening, and you would get the minister wheeled out onto the Today programme or onto BBC Breakfast. And most of the time, again, the limited time would be taken up with questioning them about gambling, whereas it would have been nice to have the pensions issue probed with the Work and Pensions Secretary rather than asking, have you ever placed a bet?
I have a different perspective on this in that I think that the fact was there wasn't any stories, and it's not journalists' job to come up with stories. It's the politicians that should come up with the policies and the news. The definition of news is new things, and they didn't do that. And if you look at the manifesto launch, there was nothing new really in either of them. So what happens is Carolyn says, if you've got the D-Day debacle or the betting scandal, of course that's going to dominate it. And you can't really say, well, it's the journalist's fault, because they are reporting what the news is. And, if the parties wanted a different shake, then they should have come up with different policies.
And Samira, being an old-timer, and I've covered an awful lot of elections, and seeing the way that things have shifted from the old days when the politicians and the parties would set the agenda themselves every day with a morning news conference. That doesn't happen anymore. And what happens when there's a vacuum? It gets filled.
Although, as you know, Carolyn, very well, those days are well over, right?
Yeah.
From the press conferences, those lines would have lasted about 2.5 minutes because the media has changed so much.
So many demands, and the media is so much more fast-moving.
Thank you. Carolyn Quinn, Katie Sell, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your comments this week. If you want to share your opinions about what you see or hear on BBC News, on TV, radio, online and social media, email newswatch@bbc.co.uk, or you can find us on X @NewsWatchBBC. You can call us on 0370 010 6676, and do have a look at previous interviews on our website bbc.co.uk/newswatch. That's all from us for now. Thank you for joining us. Do think about getting in touch and perhaps even coming on the programme. We'll be back to hear more of your thoughts about how the BBC covers the news next week. Goodbye.